The island of Jamaica is not only crucial to the history of pirates, but the history of the British Empire. This dominion has been one of the most influential in recent history, through its spread of economic model and political ideas. Before the rise of the United States, the United Kingdom left the biggest print on the world around it. But influence did not come from nowhere, and empire needed money to supply its fleets, armies, and administrators. In the early days, and even until the end, one of the most important cash cows was Jamaica, a medium-sized island by Caribbean standards, but somewhat small on a global scale. It is impressive then just how important this island was, and it can almost be entirely chalked up to sugar. Jamaica was the leading sugar producer during the days of the empire, and sugar was one of the most profitable crops. However, Jamaica was never destined to become English. It largely happened by accident, and without its acquisition, we might not have witnessed that terrifying age of piracy which terrorized the 17th century Caribbean. All of these events had their roots in the Western design, a disastrous expedition set to expand England's colonial dreams, leading to the unfortunate deaths of hundreds of men, the survivors becoming the conquerors of Jamaica, and many turning to piracy to avenge the fallen. It is one of the preludes to the rise of the British Empire and the rise of the English buccaneers, and a story worthy to be told. The origins of the Western design has its roots in the unusual political events occurring in the British Isles during the 1640s and 50s. After a long period of domestic peace and economic growth, people began to look elsewhere to improve their lives. They turned to matters of religion and politics. Most people were more or less Protestant, and some wanted to purify the English Church of its Catholic elements. There was also an interest in limiting government authority by increasing free trade and expanding political rights. Some people would take this to extreme levels by demanding collective ownership and borderline anarchy. All of this came very contrary to King Charles I, who seemingly had Catholic sympathies and did definitely not want to limit his power. Parliament eventually revolted, starting the English Civil War, the first in a series of conflicts known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. The first stage ended in 1649, when Charlie was finally captured and executed. A new government was established by the Parliamentary General, Oliver Cromwell. Whilst initially supposed to be a republic, Cromwell decided to break up Parliament in 1653, establishing a puppet one entirely nominated by Cromwell, along with England's first written constitution. It came close to making Cromwell a monarch, but he had to refuse the title of king for fear of alienating the fanatical elements of his army, which he depended upon to maintain power. Instead, he was made Lord Protector for life, and permitted to appoint his heir. England had become a military dictatorship. The Iron Hand crushed the tyrant's head and became a tyrant in his stead. Cromwell had established a new model army during the Civil Wars, a well-equipped and highly disciplined force of red-coated soldiers, able to subdue his enemies in Scotland and Ireland. Naturally, such a professional army was very expensive. In December of 1654, it was estimated at around £2.5 million a year, whereas annual revenue was just 1.5. The Commonwealth was strapped for cash, and Ollie began looking abroad for opportunities to fill his coffers. Cromwell and his cronies were Puritans, who believed in a literal interpretation of the Old Testament, and anything added to Christianity that wasn't in the Holy Book to be heresy. They closed down theaters, banned the celebration of Easter and Christmas, and required everyone to go to church on Sunday. The Puritans saw their English Commonwealth as a new Jerusalem, with many believing that it was the Fifth Kingdom that would usher the world in the final coming of Christ. Cromwell would take them on a holy crusade against the enemies of the true religion, and faith would be the deciding factor in foreign policy. It seems narratively cohesive that he would set his sights upon Spain, the foremost Catholic power, self-declared universal monarchy, and enemy of the true religion. An expedition against Spanish America had initially been proposed in 1648 by a former Catholic priest named Thomas Gage. Gage had traveled to the Americas himself before returning to England, converting to Protestantism, getting married, and publishing an account of his travels. His negative portrayal of the Spanish continued to degrade their reputation in England, and Gage tried pressing the Republicans for an expedition. He believed that the Spanish had no rights to the territory they claimed, and the expedition would serve as a means to spread the Protestant religion. Gage would serve as a personal advisor to Cromwell, and traveled along with the expedition as regimental chaplain. It wasn't until 1654 that Cromwell began to entertain the idea. Spain's anti-Protestant campaigns were funded by the flow of American silver, and by shutting it off, Cromwell could decapitate this existential threat to his New Jerusalem. He was largely motivated through correspondence with a New England clergyman, John Cotton, who prophesied that to take from the Spaniards in America would be to dry up the Euphrates, thus fulfilling the prophecy of Revelation 16:12, heralding the end of days. And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the waters thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. Naturally, the flow of this Euphrates silver would be redirected into empty English pockets, with Cromwell being assured that the piracy carried out by only 6 expedition frigates in Mexico would be enough to fund the entire design. To chalk the design entirely up to religion would be too simple, and cynical pragmatism would ultimately come before piety when talking about politics. Indeed, Cromwell had initially been considering an alliance with Spain. Both nations were embroiled in conflict against the United Provinces, one of Europe's strongest Protestant powers. Though a historical ally of the English, rival commercial interests led Cromwell to institute trade bans against them, followed by a series of wars starting in 1654. The Spanish needed an ally both against the Dutch, but also the French, and promised a return of the port city of Calais, formerly English. This would give Cromwell the chance to assist Protestant rebels in France, some of whom had even considered ceding to the Commonwealth. In the end, Cromwell made a pact with the French instead, which was just slightly less cynical than a Spanish alliance. The Catholic French had not only backtracked on their policies of religious tolerance, now fighting civil wars against their own reformed population, but also housed the pretender King of England, Charles II. As late as Easter of 1655, French troops participated in a massacre of Waldensian heretics, prompting Cromwell's Latin secretary, John Milton, to write Sonnet 15 on the late massacre in Piedmont. To imagine the thoughts inside of Cromwell's head during the early 1650s is fascinating. His personal convictions must have been constantly at odds with the needs of the state and realpolitik. The opportunity of a Spanish alliance and avenging French Protestants, with the need to plunder from Spain and empty the river Euphrates. As we can see with the Dutch conflict, Cromwell was highly concerned with trade, which was also a big motivator for the Western design. Spain restricted any foreigners from trading in the Americas, and Cromwell wanted formal Spanish recognition of English trade in the region, even if the English basically had free access already through means of smuggling. The demand for free trade would, however, serve as a convenient casus belli. After much hesitation, an ultimatum was presented to the Spanish ambassador: trade rights and religious tolerance. The ambassador said that for his master to accept these things was like giving up his own 2 eyes. The die had been cast. Strangely enough, Cromwell did not believe that an attack on the Spanish West Indies would provoke an all-out war in Europe. He was a firm believer in the principle of no peace beyond the line, meaning that politics back home were irrelevant to the constant warfare in the Americas. Indeed, Spain had previously broken treaties with the English by attacking their interests in the New World. It wouldn't hold water, however, and in 1656, Spain declared war on England. But we're getting a bit ahead. The Western design, usually called the Spanish design back then, was ambitious. The goal was to take a corps of new model soldiers to Barbados, where the force would be bolstered by local militiamen. Together, they would launch their attack. The target was Hispaniola and its capital, the city of San Domingo. From here, English privateers could intercept the Spanish treasure fleet. After capturing San Domingo, the fleet was supposed to take Puerto Rico, and even Cuba, or maybe Panama and the city of Cartagena, and Cromwell's instructions were somewhat opaque, and also included a lengthy rant about liberating the natives from the Pope and cruel Inquisition. Leaders of the expedition were General Robert Venables, who was to command the land forces, and General at Sea William Penn, commander of the fleet. Venables was a Cromwellian veteran, and though personally brave, would later be accused of poor generalship, partly because he did not consult his subordinates and called few councils of war. Penn, mostly remembered as the father of the man who established Pennsylvania, was also a veteran of some repute, even though he had been imprisoned at one point. He was an early advocate of naval line tactics and contributed to the fighting instructions that would form the basis for Royal Navy tactics till the end of sail. The fleet consisted of 60 ships, carrying 6 regiments of foot and a troop of 100 horse. Most of the foot were raw recruits, the riffraff of the London street, many pulled straight from the local jails. They were not motivated by religious zeal or some other lofty ideals, but plunder or simply dodging the noose. The officers complained of their quality. Some of them were even Irish Catholics, much to Puritan dismay. Not that the officers were much better. Many of them were veterans of good repute, but an equal amount were lazy and dull officers that have a large portion of pride, but not of wit, valor, nor activity. Another very interesting component of the army was the company of reformados, that is, soldiers from regiments that had been disbanded or destroyed. All of these reformados were disgraced gentlemen, and were certainly eager to avenge themselves, but weren't viewed much better than the rest of the troops. Consisting of 100 men, they were usually assigned as the forlorn hope, marching at the head of the army, and expected to take the brunt of ambushes, and lead a charge into the fray. About 2/3 of the soldiers were armed with matchlock muskets, 1/3 with pikes. The pikemen were dressed in breastplates and helmets, but equipping the force was difficult owing to corruption and profiteering. There was insufficient ammunition, slow match, and the pikemen didn't even have shafts for their pikes. There was also a small contingent of artillery, and 120 elite troops armed with flintlock muskets. These would primarily form the vanguard and serve as shock troops, since the fusee could be loaded much quicker than a matchee. In the end, 5,067 men were assembled, in addition to the 3,265 sailors. The fleet departed on the 20th of December, 1654, and arrived in Barbados on January 29. The plan was to recruit additional soldiers here, even if the colonials were looked down upon. One of the participants called the island "the dunghill whereon England doth cast forth its rubbish." The expedition also caused trouble with the locals when they arrested a number of Dutch ships trading with them. Cromwell had outlawed free trade with the Dutch, which the colonials relied on for supply. A significant part of the local labor force, indentured servants, were taken from the plantations and recruited into the army, having a marked economic effect. Each regiment was boosted to contain 1,000 men, and a new regiment, the Barbados Regiment, was formed. It consisted of 830 soldiers and 120 officers, NCOs, and drummers. Barbados also supplied a small troop of cavalry, a small mortar, and 2 tiny cannons. A 7th regiment was raised on St. Christopher and the Leeward Islands, and the total force soon numbered almost 10,000 men. But, as previously noted, the quality of the troops and the supplies was low. The food brought with them had been eaten up or spoiled, and the weapons problem had not been resolved. Local pike shafts were made, but these were of inferior wood and shorter than the Spanish ones. This ragtag army set sail on the 20th of March, aiming for San Domingo. Even before the launch of the expedition from London, Royalist forces had alerted the Spanish of the planned attack, and the island had prepared for their coming. A defensive militia was mustered by Don Bernardino de Meneses Bracamonte y Zapata, shortest Spanish name ever, but they did not number more than 1,500. However, many of them were excellent fighters proficient with the spear, which they had learned to use in the hunting of wild bulls. They were known as cow killers, and much like their English opponents, many of them were former criminals. The fleet decided to land some distance away from Santo Domingo, since Admiral Penn did not want to risk his ships in a direct assault on an unknown harbor. At the landing, they decided to divide the army into a larger force at the River Nitsao and a smaller diversionary force at the River Ozama. Local fishermen spotted them and alerted the defenders of the landing, and after a few hours of marching, the army was fired upon. The Spanish set fire to the savannah, driving away the roaming cattle and thus preventing the soldiers from gathering meat. As aforementioned, they were short on supplies and planned on living off the land, that is, plundering food from the locals. Nor did they have any fresh water with them, and though there were rivers the soldiers could drink from, they had not been issued any flasks. When encountering a walk of citrus trees, they fell upon it greedily and devoured the fruits. This was only a temporary reprieve, for they went to sleep without water or tents, and temperatures fell rapidly. In the morning, they rose again to a terrible heat. The main force arrived at the river Jaina, but being unable to cross, they had to march upstream until they found a ford. Here they encountered a smaller diversionary force, who had failed to make a landing on a diversion and had now lost their way. Stumbling into the main force was a sheer stroke of luck, and one of the few the army would have. They were basically waltzing around the country in blindness, until they encountered an old Irishman, who offered to lead General Venables to a point where there was good water, and from which the city could be attacked on its weakest side. However, the target proved to be void of water, and there were no streams, and the wells had been destroyed. There were no trees to provide shade, not to mention that the men were likely dressed in warmer woolen clothes intended for the English climate, and a frustrated Venables decided to hang the Irishman, much to the protestations of his council. Venables was a veteran of Cromwell's campaign in Ireland, infamous for its excessive brutality and crimes against the civilian populace. The men took out their frustration on a deserted monastery, where they found an image of the Virgin and Child adorned with gold and gemstones. These they stripped off, before pelting the image with oranges, likely rotten at this point. Consumption of bad oranges may have led to disease, or it could have been bad water or sleeping in cold conditions without shelter, but dysentery and fever had soon spread across the camp, with Venables himself being infected. Casualties were starting to mount up. Nonetheless, they came upon Santo Domingo, which at this point had been fortified. The English marched upon the city under beating drums, the Reformados leading the forlorn hope, followed by Paulet's Fusiliers and then the main force. In a body of woodland, the army was ambushed. Spanish arquebusiers fired a volley to no effect, answered by the Fusiliers. Before the flintlocks could reload, the cow-killers sprang forth with their short lances, causing heavy casualties and panic. The Fusiliers fled, but the Reformados stood their ground and fended off the ambush. According to Lieutenant Colonel Whistler, who wasn't there and had a bone to pick with Venables, the general had hid behind a tree. According to another account, Venables had gone too far and was cut off by the enemy. The Spanish reformed, and reinforcements emerged and fired 2 volleys upon the English, during which the captain of the Reformados was killed. This only served to strengthen their resolve, and their furious fire made the Spanish retreat to the cover of the fort. The Sea Regiment had intervened at this point, and pushed the Spanish through the woods and to another small fort. This one was evacuated, but the gunners remained to fire on the advancing Englishmen. 70 of the English had perished during the battle, and though Venables and his council demanded the city surrender, the men were devastated by hunger, thirst, and disease, so he had to withdraw to a sugar plantation, plundered the previous day. Spanish cavalry shadowed their retreat, and they reported a paltry scene. The ground was covered with orange peels, and elsewhere there were oranges that they had squeezed, drinking the juice in their thirst. There was sugar they had found at the mills between Isao and Jaina, and tobacco, and knapsacks, some full of clothing, others of biscuit, others of meat. and many strings of plucked fowl, squashes, little barrels and small kegs in which they carried water, some pikes and implements, a great quantity of books, like prayer books, white paper, and many shoes, some not worn. Again, the Protestants despoiled the Catholic chapel, decapitating the image of Saint Anne, removing the lips, ears, nose, and cutting wounds in her sacred face. The next day, communications were re-established with the fleet, who provided the army with much-needed provisions, albeit at a half ration. Venables went aboard to recover from his dysentery, being nursed by his wife. Many of his officers complained of him bringing the missus along, but Venables had argued that they were going to colonize a new land, and needed women with them for, building a new population and all of that. Nor was it popular with his soldiers, who didn't have any misses with them, and were currently dying of the same disease on the island, or, as Mr. Whistler put it, and now their hearts' war got out of their doublets into their breeches, and was nothing but shedding. And that is how I became fluent in flatula. Conditions only worsened, as the dry season changed to the wet, and the men had to sleep outdoors during cold nights under cold rain. While the men were out foraging for food and firewood, they were ambushed by Spanish guerrillas. The Reformados and Fusiliers acted as a guard force, and managed to repel many of the opponents. With the army at least somewhat mustered, the fleet opened fire on the city, but to no effect, either owing to long range or bad gunnery. Having brought ashore the mortar and 2 pieces of small artillery, the army prepared to march and lay siege. However, in spite of their experience with Spanish ambushes, they had no instructions for flank security, something which the enemy would exploit. The Spanish had spent a lull preparing for the upcoming engagement. Though dead bodies still littered the field, they had cleared away vegetation to provide a clear line of sight for the artillery in the forts. Arquebusiers and spearmen had been organized into a tercio formation, and an ambush laid along the roads consisting of arquebusiers, cavalry, and cow-killers. When the army came into full view, the fort opened fire to little effect. The arquebusiers fired a volley, and the English replied, killing several Spaniards. But before they could reload, the lancers and cavalry sprung forth, making the forlorn and Fusiliers retreat. Again, the Reformados stood their ground, with only 18 out of 55 ultimately surviving. The fleeing mass of men disordered the English cavalry and foot regiments. Some officers tried to stop the rout, one of them wrapping himself with the colors of his company, but they were all slain. Again, the Sea Regiment saved the day, opening their ranks to allow the retreaters to escape, before closing again and giving fire to the enemy. The Spanish pulled back to their forts, and the English mortar tried to neutralize the forts, but the Spanish concentrated their fire upon it, and more men were killed. Venables organized a desperate rearguard, and the army was in full retreat. Casualties are not entirely certain. The Spanish reported 1,500, but the reported mass graves indicated between 6 and 800. The invincible reputation of Cromwell's new model army had been shattered. This did not account for the fellows claimed by dysentery. The army made it to the river Jana, where the famished soldiers fell on their knees and drank. The water was contaminated, leading to another outbreak of flux. Morale was so bad that when 2 black slaves showed up, the English mistook them for a Spanish vanguard. Many colonial soldiers were black, and they fled into the river, where many drowned. The survivors set up camp without food or shelter, and rain began to fall. One night they heard a sudden noise, a clattering in the darkness. The men sprung from their beds and into another panic. It sounded like bandoliers, and it was surely the Spanish marching upon them. It turned out to be land crabs. Parties sent out to forage suffered frequent ambushes. The rain fell in streams, and they had to eat whatever they could get. Horses were butchered and considered a delicacy in a diet of dogs, rats, and even exotic fruits. The country was rich in local produce such as potatoes, yams, but these pale-faced Anglos had never seen these strange tubers and did not trust them. Now they were forced to eat anything they could find, including guavas, mayas, canistel, yucca, or cassava root, the latter of which is poisonous unless cooked. Indeed, it is estimated that there were as many as 40 casualties a day. Penn blamed Venables for not provisioning the men, but he could not give them what he did not have. The attack was abandoned. The men had no trust in Venables, and Venables in turn considered them a rabble. One of the officers was cashiered, dismissed and punished by being clapped in irons and sent aboard a hospital ship, where he swabbed the decks and attended to the wounded. They left behind their dead out in the open, along with piles of rubbish and a handful of deserters, who soon surrendered to the Spanish. The victors have since celebrated this day with an annual festival. For the English, not so many had died in battle, but when compiling all the casualties from abandonment, desertion and disease, they lost 4,280, almost half the army. It was a complete disaster. Ultimately, blame of the expedition should be put on Oliver Cromwell. He was too eager to launch the expedition and had forced it through his council, leading to hasty preparations, recruitment of undisciplined troops, corruption and profiteering. There were too few supplies, bad supplies, and low-quality soldiers. When he received news of the failure, he locked himself away for an entire day. Penn and Venables decided to redirect their attention to Jamaica, known to the Spanish as the Garden of the Indies. With the native Taino driven to extinction, the fertile plains along the coast were tended by black slaves, who produced large amounts of beef, fruit, sugar, spices, cotton, tobacco, and root veggies. The slave population amounted to 4,000, with Spanish inhabitants amounting to no more than 1,500, around 600 of whom were soldiers or militiamen. It seemed a much easier target than Hispaniola. On the 11th of May, the English took the Spanish off guard and landed in Caguaya Bay. They exchanged fire with a small fort, and when the English galley of 12 guns opened fire, the garrison of 300 decided to retreat. The English troops were much encouraged and threw their hats in the air, but Venables remained on deck, wrapped in a cloak, a hat slouched over his face. Apparently, he not deigned to cast a glance on the men to whose misconduct he attributed his failure. The army decided to march inland, finding the forts outside a Spanish town abandoned, before meeting with a small group carrying a flag of truce. They thought that the English had merely come for provisions, but Venables demanded the surrender of the entire island. When the English entered the town, the inhabitants had all fled. The next day, the opponents agreed to a truce, in which the English would be supplied with 200 cows per day, along with bread. Venables announced that Jamaica was to be annexed to the Commonwealth of England, and he would allow the Spanish to leave the island within 10 days with anything they could carry, but everything else, including their property, had to be left behind. To oppose was to suffer death. The governor himself soon arrived to negotiate, carried in a hammock by 2 slaves. He was an old man infected with the pox, and the English soon realized that he was an impersonator sent to buy time. Some of the Spanish had left the island, whereas others had taken their livestock and fled into the mountainous interior. Most importantly, the Spanish decided to free their slaves, giving them weaponry and allowing them to escape into the interior. Here they joined former slaves that had escaped, along with a few surviving natives, intermarrying and creating independent communities known as Maroons. Their leaders, Juan de Bolas and Juan de Serras, allied with the Spanish and began a guerrilla war against the English occupants. It would last for the next 100 or so years. The English began to look for provisions and found the fields full of cattle left behind by the Spanish. These they butchered and devoured voraciously, but lacking any butchers and having no means of preserving the meat, the carcasses were left to rot and waste. This was later condemned by the buccaneer scholar William Dampier, writing the following in his 2 Voyages to Campeche. Jamaica is a remarkable instance of this our folly, in this particular. For when it was first taken by the English, the savannas were well stocked with cattle, but were soon all destroyed by our soldiers, who suffered great hardships afterwards for it. By great hardships, Dampier referred to the starvation that followed, with the soldiers forced to eat fruit at best, and at worst, dogs, mules, and rats. Sanitary conditions were poor and disease flourished. Survivors reported the horrible smell, and how the dead were buried in graves so shallow that dogs could dig up and eat them.
Roro Raggy, we eating good tonight.
Regardless, Jamaica was at least somewhat secured, and instructions were sent back home asking for reinforcements, along with colonists to settle down and tend the soil. Penn decided to return home, ashamed over the Hispaniola fiasco. Venables arrived shortly thereafter, and both of them were charged with desertion by the angry protector. They were thrown into the tower until they could admit their guilt and surrender their commissions, which they did in late October of 1655. The situation on Jamaica wasn't so good. After a string of commanders died of disease, the mantle of leadership eventually fell on Colonel Doyley. His first move was to purge a rival contender, fellow veteran Holdep. Holdep was accused of embezzlement, deported, and his regiment of St. Christopher broken up. The soldiers and Holdep's lands were taken by his accusers. Nonetheless, Doyley proved an energetic figure, and the situation soon improved. A wave of colonists soon arrived, most of whom died, along with reinforcements from England. Unlike the initial expedition, these primarily consisted of veterans of the New Model Army. They might have included the mysterious Swan, a veteran of the Irish War who was still operating as a buccaneer in the 1680s. Still, Doyley was eventually replaced by Major General Edward Brain, who assigned the soldiers to areas of cultivation under a field officer. However, these rowdy men had no desire to become farmers, many being former indentured servants, and there were few women for them to marry and build families with. Disease and starvation continued taking its toll. With the occupants so weakened, the Maroons went on the offensive. Spanish colonies had supplied them with food, weapons, and ammunition, and in 1656, a Spanish expedition consisting of 30 Spaniards and 15 Maroons built a small stockade, from whence they assaulted isolated farms and parties. In 1657, their force had grown to 170, and they defeated a small body of English troops west of Spanish Town. With the death of the new governor, Doyley resumed his command. To assist him in the guerrilla campaign, he invited 250 buccaneers from Tortuga. These men were cattle hunters from Hispaniola, experienced in fighting the cow killers at their own game. Guerrilla war in the jungle. They would pass on their tactics to the soldiers, and rather than fighting in closed ranks, they would do so in small groups, operating independently. Meanwhile, the English capital at Caguay was being fortified, and privateering commissions issued to the captains of the former fleet. Jamaica sat at a prime position smack dab in the Caribbean midpoint, a perfect spot for launching attacks on Spanish colonies and shipping. The English adopted a strategy of offensive defense, reliant on privateers to assault the Spanish before they could be attacked in turn. The slaves and cash taken as plunder was then reinvested in Jamaica, allowing for the rapid growth of the young colony. Jamaica had been secured, but at what cost? Thousands of men had died, and in order to defend the island, the governors had virtually handed it over to the buccaneers. Whilst crucial to the early expansion of the colony, the buccaneers would eventually become a problem when England desired peace with Spain, something which the buccaneers didn't give much of a care about. Many of the expedition veterans, being former criminals, indentured servants, and general scoundrels, would turn to buccaneering as a means of living. The Western design was very much their proving grounds, and they learned a lot from it. They learned how they should dress, lightly and appropriate to the climate, how they should arm themselves, flintlock muskets and cartridges instead of the unwieldy matchlock, how they should fight in the terrain, speedily as skirmishers, without cumbersome artillery and expensive cavalry, how they should gather water and provision themselves, how they should prepare cattle into provisions, and how they should gather intelligence and guides to conduct their campaigns. The design also had implications back home in England, and how the nation would conduct its empire building in the near future. The design was very much an anomaly in that previous rulers had largely stayed out of colonial affairs, letting it be handled by private persons instead. This operation was a direct involvement, and as it shows, it was costly and impractical. After taking Jamaica, the English discovered that it was easier and more effective to commission or just sponsor private persons, buccaneers, to expand their imperial interests in the Caribbean. So in one way they reverted to the imperial policy of Elizabeth, except that this one would have wider and more horrid consequences, since the buccaneers were much less manageable than the gentleman captains like Francis Drake. The lessons of the Western design turned the buccaneers into a terrifying fighting force, and for the rest of the century they held the region in a constrictive grip. Lead among them was a militia captain on Jamaica, who would eventually grow to be their grand chieftain, Harry Morgan. But to hear about his story, you will have to wait.
A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.